Welcome everyone to the last section of the Founders of the Future Forum. I'm your host, Pierre-Simon, co-founder of Founders of the Future, and I couldn't be more thrilled for this next session. We have the honor of receiving Eric Schmidt, former CEO and chairman of Google and co-founder of Schmidt Futures. And we're going to talk about why future founders should solve the world's biggest problems, which is, as you know, is something really important for founders of the future. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Lynn Anderson-Clark, strategic partnership lead at Founders Factory, to kick off this interview.
Thank you, Pierre. Good evening, London. Good afternoon, New York, and welcome to London Tech Week and the Founders of the Future Forum. I'm Lynn Anderson-Clark, and I'm thrilled to be joined by Eric Schmidt today to talk about something near and dear to both of us: why the next generation of founders should focus on the world's greatest problems. Now, Eric needs no introduction, especially with this crowd, but I'm going to attempt to give him one. Eric Schmidt is an accomplished technologist, entrepreneur, and philanthropist. As Google's chief executive officer, he pioneered Google's transformation from a Silicon Valley startup to a global leader in technology. In addition to transforming Google, one could argue he's touched all of our lives with products such as Google Search, Maps, email, and fundamentally how the world's information is organized. And if you need any further information, you can Google it. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Eric Schmidt. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you very much, Lynn, and great to see you.
Thank you. So, Eric, you are best known for getting the most out of young founders with Larry and Sergey. And what we want to learn from you today is how to replicate that and how to support the next generation of entrepreneurs so we can better this world. So to get right into it, what are the most pressing challenges facing society today?
Well, there's such a long list. Let's start with the pandemic. And obviously our governments have collectively failed us. Everything that you can do to ameliorate the situation, to increase the rate of testing, to help us understand how to manage this disease. It's not going to go away in 6 months or a year. It'll be with us forever. Hopefully we can get it to the point where it's in a box in the way that the flu is. But at the moment, it's the damage that the pandemic is doing is so much larger than any of the other concerns people have. Think about the increase in inequality that's occurring because of the pandemic. Think of the impact on women who have a tougher time anyway because of all their other duties. Think of the impact on essentially underserved minorities in typical examples. I can just go on and on and on. So we need to address that, and any ideas are welcome. The biggest area of promise is probably the application of artificial intelligence to solving problems that have heretofore been unsolvable. And whether that's in chemistry or synthetic biology or the way people operate or language or education, that's probably the next big area. But I'm one of these people, as you know, Lynn, who believes in the power of a founder's vision. So I'm going to let the founders tell me what they think is most important, and I'm going to encourage them to run and work really hard at it.
Wonderful. So we've got pandemic, we've got inequality, we've got so many of these issues. What are the ways where we can encourage more entrepreneurs to tackle these problems?
Well, it's interesting that people have a funny bias about entrepreneurs because at some level, entrepreneurs are risky. They are disruptive in certain ways. And societies seem, as they mature, to become less dynamic and less entrepreneur friendly. There's more and more regulations, et cetera. In my years in working in Europe and in Britain, it's interesting that talking about entrepreneurs, you get this sort of head shake, like, yes, I understand, and then nothing happens because nobody wants to take the risk. So let me give you an example. and we'll pick on Europe because it's always a good target. Imagine a situation where a small company could be founded in one day, and that small company could be managed up to 10 employees without a lot of regulations except for health and safety. In other words, let's just make it really easy to start 10-person companies. And when you got to 11, well, then all the other rules would apply. That would be a simple way to accelerate what Founders Forum is trying to do at scale. And one of the things about entrepreneurship that I learned is it's about shots on goal. So I was very, very lucky that I found Larry and Sergey, who were brilliant founders, and I worked with them collectively. And that's 1,001 or 1,000,001 shot. There were so many that didn't make it. And you need a lot of shots on goal, or whatever your metaphor is. Now, what's interesting about Britain is Britain, starting in London and Cambridge, and now with some success in Oxford and other places, is beginning to build that entrepreneurial culture, and that's fantastic.
Excellent. So I want to turn now to Schmidt Futures, which is an organization you started, which the aim is to advance society through science and technology, and work together across fields. I know you put $1 billion of your own money behind this, so I know it's something you feel very passionately about. Can you tell us more about the initiative and what you're trying to accomplish with it?
Well, you and I have actually talked about this over the years, and I started off focused on science because I figured science was what got me and Google and all of us to our current level of success. In other words, we need to recognize that we didn't do this ourselves, that we built on the shoulders of great giants, right, who really helped us along the way. And that things like the microprocessor revolution, the GPS, all of those were necessary preconditions for the smartphone and the networks and so forth that we take for granted today. When I showed up at Google, by the way, people would say, oh yeah, we had a terabyte of this. And I said, do you have any idea how big a terabyte is? And they'd say, oh, it's not that big. And I'd say, well, let me tell you, when I was doing this, this is what a megabyte was, and this is a gigabyte and so forth. And the technology has moved so quickly that people don't take a moment to credit the generation before. So we always have to start with that. What I think now is that we should focus really on the exceptional talents that underlie entrepreneurship and science and so forth. To be very blunt, there are people who are simply exceptionally talented. We see this in the arts, everyone accepts that. It's also true in science, it's true in leadership, it's true in verbal skills, it's true in every conceivable thing. So I thought the best way to apply the gifts that I've received through my service at Google was to focus on that. We announced a program with the Rhodes Trust called RISE, which, as an example, which is an attempt to identify the top initially 100 16-year-olds around the world, many of whom are going to be in countries where they don't have access to the kind of educational systems and opportunities that, frankly, everyone who's part of Founders Forum and this next generation of leadership, you've had. Well, what about the people who are stuck in some bunker somewhere and who are as smart as you, if not smarter? How do we get them to their highest potential? So I ultimately concluded that talent was the real vector, and that's where the $1 billion goes, with partners.
Amazing. So going off of this talent first approach, if you were to walk into a high school anywhere in the world, and you would have to pick out, using whatever process you'd like to use, that next brilliant founder that can change the world, what would be the process to do that, or how would you go about that?
Well, I guess I've done this long enough that I've developed some, at least, biases as to what that person might look like. And there are always exceptions. There's always the person who's nonverbal, who can't communicate, but somehow writes in a way that's extraordinary. But my experience is that the sort of exceptional people do everything well. So they write well, they are analytical, they speak well, they have a sense of reasoning. The scientists say that this is essentially type 2 thinking, that they can think deeper, right? So what I always try to do when I meet somebody young is I ask them, tell me about your world, and I see if they say something perceptive or new, as opposed to repeating the zeitgeist. And if someone can deliver an insight and an idea that they're passionate about, that's a pretty good predictor that they're going to be successful. There's a lot of literature about grit. People are probably familiar with this, that it's not just raw horsepower, the ability to compute faster in your head. It's also persistence and perseverance. Over the years, I've known quite a few people who were so smart they couldn't get through the day. And of course, nothing happened as a result. Or they had emotional problems or family problems or what have you, and they couldn't. And that's a lost opportunity. So it seems to me that you need both. You need that quickness, which is insight, it's thinking, it's passion, and so forth. But you also need resilience. And resilience is something that's not really taught, except perhaps in your family, or maybe it's genetic, I don't really know. But that ability to keep hearing and know. So if you think about entrepreneurs, the entrepreneur you want to work with is the one which, when they hear that the big company has just stolen the product, making a huge copy and entering the market, that entrepreneur, instead of wilting away, oh my God, oh, a disaster, instead they double down and they work harder and they work quicker because they have a strong opponent. They rise to the challenge. And I think that's the characteristic that you're looking for in leadership.
Something you said that really stuck with me was, tell me about your world. And if you can get insight from that, I feel like that's going to be my new question. When I interview people for our company, I feel like that's just tell me about your world. I think it's so simple, but can be really insightful. Let's switch to funding. Now, funding is top of mind for both current and future founders. It's something that we think about quite often. And although there's been a steady rise in impact investing, one could argue it's easier to get a photo sharing app funded rather than something that could change the world. What can we do as an ecosystem, as a startup ecosystem, to change this? And what would be your advice for the young founders out there that are really trying to walk that tightrope of profit and purpose?
Well, the ideal solution is you do both, right? That your investors and yourself are rewarded handsomely for your hard work, but you're also serving a greater cause. Not all business opportunities are that, but many are. And the entrepreneurs that I've worked with always start by talking about a higher purpose. Now, maybe that's how their brains work, but it's also how they recruit. If I called you and I said, look, we're going to make a tremendous amount of money here, and everything we do is going to be reprehensible, that's not a very good recruiting pitch. And when I say, well, we're going to make a fair amount of money here, but what we're going to do is serve, you're going to be proud to work here, that recruiting works really well. What I've noticed now, which 20 and 30 years ago, nobody understood what we did, but now the major corporations have reputations. And so if you say, as a young person, I work at Google, or I'm doing a startup in this area, or I work at Apple, or whatever, people say, wow, cool. They're impressed. And that matters. So I think you have to achieve both. If you have a choice between making money and serving a social purpose, try to achieve both somehow. Try to figure out a way to get paid for doing good.
And it's interesting what you said. I think, employees are very much the new stakeholders, right? It was shareholders, and now employees are very much part of that ecosystem. So before we continue, I just want to do a quick note on the audience. So in addition to the wider tech community attending, we've got a really interesting audience of 50 young founders aged 16 to 30 who are part of the Founders of the Future Fellowship, who are committed to creating purpose-driven startups. And they will have an opportunity later in this session to ask Eric a question directly. So if you're part of that group, drop a question in the chat box and we can tee that up shortly. So to speak directly to this group, founders, especially young founders, I think are terrified of making mistakes. It's something that I think about quite frequently. Can you make us all feel a bit better and tell us about a mistake or two that you've made?
Well, I've made so many. One of the things about success is that you don't have to make all the decisions correctly, but you have to make some of them correctly. I remember talking to my friend and board member, John Doerr, who'd recruited me to Google a couple of years into it. And I said, John, I'm really, really happy with this. It was the right decision. I'm so grateful to you for giving me this opportunity. I said it in a really nice way. And he said, well, you did one thing right. And I said, expecting some list of achievements. And he said, you said yes. 2 people before you said no. And I tell you that story to say, sometimes the opportunity that's before you is confusing, but good judgment is really important. I was extremely fortunate in one thing, which is I said yes to a young opportunity. And since I should talk about Brent for a minute and Founders Forum. Founders Forum has been around since I've been going to tech stuff in London. And he sort of pioneered this model in Europe incredibly successfully. And these opportunities, what's interesting is when you see them, they seem small, and then 5 years later, they're immense corporations. So the formula that was invented by the combination of Founders Forum and what we're doing today works. And what you don't realize you're making history when you are. All you think is, oh, these are smart people. This is interesting. So a lot of success, what I would say is, has to do with being in the right group, right? So in my case, I had worked with John when I was at Sun. I met Larry and Sergey. I said, this is too raw for me. It's too risky. John said, oh, you'll do fine. You'll like it. It's really high potential. Give it a try. And so that influence, so the network that I had really helped me. And I think it's underestimated how important these networks of founders are. It's underestimated how important the judgment part is, especially with young founders, because they simply haven't done things long enough to have had the experience.
So saying yes is important. You are a big advocate of diversity, and I think diversity in its widest sense. Can you share not only your view on diversity, but how it's going to help us address getting more young entrepreneurs to solve these challenges?
One answer about diversity is that it's a pure business argument. If you look at diverse teams, they produce better. There's plenty of science around this. So for all the sort of white guys who sort of collect themselves in little cabals, they're underperforming. Excuse the stereotype. They are underperforming what they could do if they worked in a more diverse environment. There's plenty of literature to this effect. And diversity brings in different views. And when it's well managed, right, you can build a consensus that's stronger. And often the diverse view is the non-consensus view. And often the non-consensus view is the winning view. So in other words, people, because they're the same, they have the same. So diversity is not just about people. It's also about the way you listen to things and so forth and so on. And so diversity and inclusion, which is sort of the mantra, really reflects diverse people and the inclusivity of their approaches and ideas. Now, in a hierarchy, there has to be a decider, right? So the ideal scenario is that you allow this diversity and inclusion to occur, and when you pick that. And if you don't have a best idea, you have the wrong team. So your job as an executive is to organize the people. And what happens with founders is, by the nature of being founders, they have to be superhuman at everything. And they tend to want to make all the decisions. Whereas my job as CEO was to make no decisions, except the ones that were really important, and otherwise run the process. And I think for your young founders, they have to do everything. But most importantly, they have to build a team that will get them through the growth stage. The canonical failure in Europe has been that the companies wouldn't scale to a certain size. They would become medium-sized companies, but they didn't have the leadership maturity. They sold out too early. That was sort of the canonical view. I think in Britain, we're beginning to see some companies, and we're seeing a few in Europe that are large-scale companies. But it's still the case that America has an advantage in building large-scale companies, as does China, for whatever set of reasons. And I think one of the secrets is to build a team that is diverse and inclusive, but also one that will scale with the company. Because it's ultimately the value of the company is in the people in the company and really not much else.
Right. And we both grew up in the US, kind of going down that kind of differences between the US and UK. We actually both grew up in Virginia. I know we alluded to it prior, but I think in the US there can be this thought of failure can be celebrated. And a lot of times you'll hear a founder say, well, you're not really a founder unless you failed 2 times and kind of get yourself back up and dust yourself off. And I think in the UK, I think there's a bit more of a stigma attached to that failure. And I think it's just a cultural difference. But can you give us your view on, risk appetite and failure and what we might be able to learn from your view on that?
If you look at the most successful companies in my world, they're almost universally founded by people in their early to mid 20s. And when you look at pictures of these people, they look like children compared to what they are now. So go back and look at pictures of Steve Jobs when Apple was founded, or Bill Gates when Microsoft was founded. So it looks to me like the skills that we're talking about break early. In other words, that the skills of Michael Dell, right, founded Dell in his dorm room. And there's just a long pattern of this. So what I would suggest is that the way to solve the perception and structural problem is to focus on precisely the group that we're talking about now, which are younger founders, and get them empowered to win, right? There's something about the challenge to authority, the nonconformity of young people that is, it's politically correct to say, well, everyone can be a founder and so forth and so on. But let me just observe that the majority of the companies were founded by very young people who often had very, very discordant ideas, very different ideas about how to run the companies, how to behave. They're controversial. And that's the success. If you look at Elon Musk, right? He's been a founder. Look at Travis and Uber. Uber was his 4th company, right? Again, these are controversial, but very impactful people. We need more such people, not fewer. And they will test the system, but they will ultimately add enormous wealth to the society if they're allowed to be successful.
That's great. So we will be throwing to questions very shortly. So Ben Fisher, get ready. You're going to be up next. But I want to switch gears really quickly because I learned a lot from your podcast, Reimagine with Eric Schmidt. And if the audience out there has not listened to it yet, it is like a masterclass in geopolitical, what's happening. I mean, just listen to that for an hour. You don't need an MBA, in my opinion. But it's all about how to rebuild a better post-COVID-19 society. And what I wanted to talk to you about is the amount of information you must have to distill and get and process in order to be able to talk about all of these things is enormous. What is your information routine? How can we kind of learn from what you do to kind of get all of the information that we need to be great founders?
So the podcast is called Reimagine with Eric Schmidt. And it's an attempt for me to bring a little bit more rational discourse into the politicized and sort of crazy stuff. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to get some substantive conversations. And so if you have the patience for a podcast, which I think this audience does, I hope people enjoy it. As an executive, you get very good at processing an awful lot of information every day and keeping the important aspects. When I was a scientist, the whole idea was to be incredibly narrowly focused. And as an executive, you need to be broadly focused. And so it's a skill that you can learn. And what I found works is, for me personally, is just talking to people. Because if you listen to people, which is often hard for people because they prefer to talk and listen to themselves, you'd be amazed what insight and nuance you can get from the approaches. So I always ask people, what's most important to you? What's going on? How does it feel to be you? And that forms the matrix that I then apply the written sources. One of my great regrets is that the internet and social media has made it almost impossible for at least me to read books, right? My attention span has gotten shorter. I don't know about if you have that problem, but I used to be able to read a book a week on an airplane, and now I spend on that airplane. I guess we're not traveling that much, but in theory on the airplane, working, doing my email and so forth. Yeah. I do worry that I don't have enough time for that sort of long thinking, sort of the deep thinking. And the young people that I work with have various mechanisms for that. So for example, when they're working on something really hard, they'll turn their phone off and really concentrate on writing this paragraph or doing this formula. Then they turn their phone back on. But you need some mechanism to address the attention deficit problem.
Yeah, absolutely. It is now time to take a few questions from our young founders. And again, this is a really interesting group between 16 and 30, part of the Founders of the Future Fellowship. So I'm now going to throw it to Anne-Laure. Is that right, Anne-Laure?
Yes, that's right.
Welcome. So please go ahead with your question to Eric.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Eric. That was super interesting. And what you just said about deep thinking really resonated with me. I do put my phone in another room too when I'm working. So thanks for saying that. And
how long do you do it for?
Sometimes like only 15 minutes if I really need to not be distracted, and sometimes for an hour. But
my God, an hour! I'm impressed. Good job.
Yeah, I'm managing my addiction, basically. So yeah, my question is, when it comes to both educating and inspiring the founders of the future, when and where do you think this should happen? Like, do you think this is something that should happen as early as possible in childhood, or through lifelong learning, through schools? Should someone else take care of it? So yeah, I've had lots of debates about this with friends, and I would love to hear your opinion on this.
Well, I'd be interested in your opinion on this. My take of this is that the entrepreneurial skills are probably visible at 15, 16, 17, somewhere in there. And so you could imagine high schools, or whatever high schools are called in whatever country we're talking about, could begin to have the equivalent of entrepreneurship clubs where the students teach each other. The most effective education is where students teach each other something that they think the teachers don't understand. And so if, one project would be to try to kick off high school entrepreneurship and college entrepreneurship that's really student-led. But if you follow it, if you're going to be the next Michael Dell or what have you, and found the company in your dorm room, you better have been exposed to the concept that it was okay to do so by 15 or 16. So it's pretty early.
Yeah, this is because you asked what I thought about it. I tend to agree with you. And at the same time, part of me don't want to leave behind all of the people who didn't have the opportunity to get that inspiration and education. And I think there are founders that have the skills, have the intelligence necessary to be an entrepreneur, and maybe lack the confidence because they haven't been told that this isn't something that they can do. So yeah, I agree with you. And at the same time, I would love to see more initiatives for people who haven't realized yet by age 30 or 40 that they can actually do it.
I think that, well, first of all, I think that's exactly correct. And I teach venture capital at Stanford, and we've been studying what I'll call older successful executives who are typically in their 30s and 40s. And it works well too, and they have different risk profiles. So the key thing has to do with appetite for risk and the belief in yourself. And so you have to be willing to say, I'm going to give it a try. In my case, I left a large company to go give it a try with Larry and Sergey at Google because it was just so interesting. But I was able to do that precisely because I had been successful enough that I had enough money to have a house and a car and the kids in school and so forth. So my risk tolerance was not, it wasn't as risky as it may have sounded. It wasn't like I was going to end up on the street, if you will.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you so much, Eric.
Thank you, Anne-Laure. I'm now going to throw it to Ben. Ben, tell us your question for Eric.
Hi. So yeah, it's kind of building on the point you raised a minute ago about what you're talking about politically. So at the moment, it feels like we're living in a somewhat divided world, and politically, it seems countries have become more nationalistic and isolated, especially due to the pressures of coronavirus. this seems to be in stark contrast to the openness and inclusivity that we promote online. And Google was famously blocked in China's Great Firewall. And recently, more technology services have been banned by different states and different embargoes. So I just kind of wanted to hear what your thoughts are on political censoring of information and technology.
Have we perhaps lost Eric? Just making sure he's still. Okay. Well, this is my opportunity to tell a few jokes, kill some time. But Ben, really interesting question. You actually kind of stole my closing question. I think it's something that tech will play a huge role in. And so I think, and Eric is definitely the person to be answering this. So just hold tight. We're going to get Eric back online. The joys of working from home during coronavirus, of not having a office. Ben, where are you coming in from?
I'm currently in a client's office at the moment. So I nipped out and stole one of their meeting rooms so I could jump on the call. Thought I couldn't miss this. So had to be done.
Excellent. And have you learned anything so far?
Yeah, it's been really, really, really interesting, to be honest. I think one of the things that really interested me was his opinions on how it's important to have a diverse team, and kind of built on the ideas that were explored earlier on the talk with Nile Rodgers and everything going on at the moment with Black Lives Matters, and making sure the BAME community is promoted enough in the current climate. So very, very interesting.
Yeah, there are a few things that I've written down. One was saying yes. And I think that's something that it's a really good life mantra. And as he said, there were two people that turned down that Google CEO job. And he'll be the first to tell you that the only reason he was able to get that job is because two people before him turned it down. And they turned it down for different reasons. But I think one of them was, it was just a small piece of this company. And I'm sure now, with Google being what it is now, I'm sure there's probably a bit of regret there. But saying yes is really important. And then the shots on goal, I thought was really interesting. We need to figure out how to, all hands on deck, how we can make sure that we are getting as many people focused on these problems as early as possible, because tech will be ultimately the thing that, in my personal opinion, that can save us. And to your question, that, obviously there's some negative things, right, as well, that we're going to need to control. But I think that ultimately tech will be the thing that saves us. And so how do we mobilize this community and figure out, and also how to get them interested? And I think that also goes back to my point about sometimes funding a photo app might be easier than funding something that could save the world. Yeah. So I think...
Absolutely. Building on that as well, I went to a talk recently, and I can't remember who the guy was that gave the talk, but he was the Chief Innovation Officer at Disney. And he told a little story, which was super interesting, where, are we back?
Oh, wonderful, Eric.
Perfect.
Yes. I was happily listening to Ben and Lynn's conversation while the Zoom gods would not allow me in back as a panelist.
I mean, I've been doing like a little comedy routine. So Ben,
this one was not my fault. This was Zoom's.
No problem at all, Ben. Just because we're getting short on time, can you?
So let me see if I can answer Ben's question. I think.
Okay,
sure. So my answer is pretty simple. Every one of these restrictions that's put in around speech and commerce is going to hurt us globally. I would much rather have a global network and deal with some of the consequences of that. And as you know, the rise of nationalism is an easy excuse to begin to limit speech, limit access, and so forth. And there are all sorts of people who would like to, for example, promote a local competitor and so forth. But from my perspective, the genius of what we've built, as you said, Ben, this sort of notion of this one global platform, I would fight hard for that. And I think for you in particular, think about how much harder it will be for your company if there are 100 different networks and 100 different ways in which they operate. It's likely that we're going to end up with sort of a Chinese-centric one and a Western-centric one, right? Because of the actions that you can see. I obviously don't know what will happen, but I don't like that. but let's see if we can keep it to 2 and not 10.
Well said.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ben. We've got one final question from the group, from Nadal. Is Nadal here? Here we go. Nadal, if you can hear me, go ahead and ask your question to Eric.
Hello, Eric. It's nice to meet you. I hope it's not too bad. I'm just sitting in the park. It's really nice weather here. I was watching an interview actually last week where you were saying, as a founder, when you're starting a company, you should be dreaming big, hire interesting people, and try to have a 5-year plan, because most people tend to have 2 or 3 year plan. I want to challenge you a little bit of thinking the next 10, 20 years as a young entrepreneurs. What do you think are the most crucial aspects we should try to fix or solve using the tech and the AI and the quantum computing? And the second part of that question is, as we grow, how do we ensure as leaders to make sure that we protect of not being evil, as they say, and have that emphasis from the ground up? I think that you made a really interesting comment with a company in Japan where they have this Kanban system where they can stop at any point where they feel that the product is not right. How do we make sure that big companies, as they grow, they have that emphasis? But firstly, what should we focus on as young tech entrepreneurs?
So what I like about your question is most people have trouble thinking about 5 years, and you're already thinking 10 or 15. And a lot of the answer to your question has to do with the values of the founder. That's why it's so special to be a founder. You get to decide the kind of company that you want. And my advice on that is, imagine when you have 100 people, is this how you want it to behave? Or will you be proud of the way they interact? Will you be proud of their values? This is the time to set it, because once it's set, it's very difficult to change. Once culture is set, it's very difficult to alter in any particular way. When I go back to 20 years from now, I think there's some things to say. The world will be much more populous. There'll be many, many more people in Asia and many, many more people in Africa. So the global needs of the platform will be far greater. I'm assuming that for the rest of my lifetime, and perhaps yours, the battle structurally between the Chinese model and the Western model will continue. Not because one is better than the other, but because there's simply so much money at stake for both. So I would try to figure out a way to bridge that in an interesting way. I think it's fair to say that in the next 10 to 15 years, there will be enormous advances in both biology more broadly, as well as in software and AI, but in particular in complicated systems. So not only will there be more people, but the systems that you will be building in 15 years will be infinitely more complicated than the ones you're building now. I'll give you an example. One day I went in to look at the Google spreadsheet people, and I figured it was like a team of like 12 people. Well, by the time you look at Google Docs, it was 150 people. And I said, how could you possibly need 150 people to do Google Docs, which is a fantastic product, by the way? And the answer was, well, we need this and this and this and this and this and this. And this 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 and this. Okay. And by the way, that's what it takes to have a fantastic product. So you should imagine that one of your challenges is going to be managing the complexity of the platforms that you're building. And I think that's often not understood. But in fact, the decisions you make now will determine that level of complexity. Get that right.
Makes sense. That's awesome.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nadal.
Thank you.
So we are coming to the end of our session, sadly. But just to kind of continue on the larger picture of tech, because Eric, I think you are one of the most qualified and fascinating people to talk to about this. So we both believe that tech will be addressing the largest problems in the future. So whether that's, inequality, pandemic, et cetera. But then there's also this falling trust in the public, and the Edelman Barometer Trust 2020, largest dip in recorded history for big tech. And then you've got unelected leaders, kind of shaping geopolitical things. How do we reconcile the great promises of tech with that falling public trust?
The trust is earned and lost over time. And people try to sort of say, well, I want to promote my brand. Well, the best way to establish a brand is to do something useful. So my general comment about trust is people will trust the system if it's trustworthy, if it makes sense. But if they find stuff in the system, social media being the most obvious, which they find reprehensible, then their trust level will be lower. So I always start with an search inside yourself argument. You better make the product itself good. In Google's case, when we were learning how to build our advertising system, we would have gains. And we ultimately came to a model where we would take half the gain to revenue, which is to the shareholders, and half the gain to improving the search accuracy. That was how we balanced it. And if we had only done one or the other, I don't think we would have been successful. We had both masters. So my advice would be to try to find a way to balance it, to earn the trust. And if you do that, eventually the politics will work itself out.
Wonderful. Wonderful way to close the session. Again, unfortunately, our time has come to an end. Eric, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you join me today. Thank you for your time and your insight on such an important topic.
And thank you to all. And I look forward to having all of you become enormously successful and talking about meeting you from here. Thanks very much.
Absolutely. And to our audience, thank you for attending. Make sure to tune into the next session of Founders of the Future Forum, which is Mental Health and Human Performance, Tech Founders versus Elite Athletes, which is coming up at 6:30 p.m. UK time. Thank you, take care, and have a wonderful evening.